Okay, good evening, everybody. We are going to start today our study Anima and Animals. We'll talk about the woman. Anahy, please. Welcome.
Thank you, Mariana. Hello, everyone. So today is a very interesting topic for us to discuss, the concepts of anima and animus. Let me just see if I can. Okay. So just a reminder, we have already seen this picture, is Jung's model of the psyche, okay? And so just for us to go over again, here is the ego and the self. So the ego self axis, okay? And what is very important today, because people get a little confused with the concepts of anima and animus. Are they complexes? Are they archetypes? They are both, okay? So that's why I'm showing again this graphic, this picture. Why? Because, okay, so here we have the personal unconscious with the complexes that we have already seen, the C for complexes. And you see that for each complex, they are connected to they are connected to the archetypes that are in the collective unconscious, okay? So just for us to go again, one of the through the concept of the complexes, okay? So we could think of the complexes. We have already seen the concepts, but I think it's interesting for us to take a look again. So complexes are dynamic elements of the psychic system that have their own functions within that system and are formed from an autonomous set of impulses grouped around ideas and emotions charged with energy. So remember that we've seen when we talked about complex that Jung says that usually complex are formed because of a moral conflict, something that the ego like represses or denies, and it splits from consciousness. So it goes to the unconscious, the personal unconscious, okay? And we can also think as subpersonalities. The complexes are as subpersonalities. But what is important today is to understand that every complex has a nucleus, which is the archetype. So for each complex, we can recognize an archetype as at its center. So you see here, each complex is connected to an archetype. So for instance, the ego, the shadow, the maternal and paternal complexes, among others, are examples of complexes that are formed as a consequence or a condition, we could say, of our psychic reality. So this is very important to understand that when we talk about complexes, we are also talking about archetypes, because the archetype is the center of the complex, okay? So the anima and animus, it's quite interesting, this topic. So the concept of anima and animus is one of the most popular concepts of Jungian psychology. Originally, it was created by C.G. Jung to define the unconscious opposite to the social mask of personality, the persona that we have already seen when we talked about the shadow, and so it's opposite the persona, the social mask, okay? So this concept, anima and animus, was created by Jung to define the unconscious opposite to the social mask of personality, the persona. Thus being an archetype that links, but in the sense of the function, okay? Because the opposite of the persona we could think as complexes is the shadow, right? But here, this analyst, oh, by the way, the link is below, okay? It's a very nice paper in the site of the International Association for Analytical Psychology. The link is below. So, C.J. Jung, okay, wanted to define the unconscious opposite to the social mask of personality, persona, thus being an archetype that links the conscious ego to the unconscious, and an archetypal image that contains all those features and functions that are present in the psyche in a more or less latent form, but are not manifested in the conscious life and not available to the conscious ego. But we are going to understand this better, okay? So we are talking about a function, a complex that means also a relational function. We are going to see this. So the shadow we can understand as the opposite of the persona, in a sense of something that it's not accepted by the ego, and it doesn't help adaptation to the collective, okay, to the outside world. As the persona, everything that it's okay for our social mask to present to others, to present to the outside world. But the animals, okay, they are also, we can think of unconscious opposites of the persona, because the persona is linking the ego, let's say, to the outside world in a sense of interaction. And the anima and animals, as we are going to see, they link the conscious ego to the unconscious, so to the world within, okay? And as it's written here, an archetypal image, they are archetypal images that contain all those features and functions that are present in the psyche in a more or less latent form, but are not manifested in the conscious life and not available to the conscious ego. Let's see this a little better. So originating in the idea that animus archetype, now we're talking about them as archetypes, okay, is a counterpart of gender identity. These images are traditionally considered as feminine for men and masculine for women, because in Latin, Jung used anima and animus, because in Latin, anima is the feminine, while animus is the masculine gender, both defining the soul. So this idea both attracts and stimulates the most ardent discussions among modern specialists, mostly because in Jung's time, the concrete definitions of what was considered as masculine character or behavior, or what was considered as feminine, hardly coincide with what is observed in modern times. However, it does not contradict either the idea that the unconscious psyche is a counterpart of the conscious identity. Gender, it's one of our basic conscious identity, nor the notion of the healthy balance, this is very important, of different functions in the psyche that helps the individual to evaluate and stimulates growth and development of consciousness, okay? So this is very important, because nowadays, with all this discussion of what is feminine and masculine, and many times a healthy discussion, because we have both functions, let's say we have both identities, if we could say, they belong to our psyche, to our inner and our world, in the way that we see ourselves, but also in the way that our unconscious act. Okay, so what this analyst is saying in this paper is that this idea both attracts and stimulates this discussion, because of all the discussion that is going on to this day, nowadays, what's masculine and feminine. But, however, it does not contradict, and this is very important, that it's one of the things I think, and one of the real important issues that analytical psychology, or Jungian psychology, as if you want, is so up to date, okay? Because, so this kind of concept, anima and animus, they don't contradict either the idea that the unconscious psyche is a counterpart of conscious identity. Remember, we are always talking about duality here, the psyche, okay, not in the spiritual dimensions, but here, in this experience in the material world, we are very dual, okay, the good and bad, the beautiful and ugly, the feminine and masculine, the shadow and the light, okay? So our material world and the psyche has to deal with these two dimensions, the material dimension and the spiritual dimension, okay? So, of course, this idea, anima and animus, Jung's idea, so doesn't contradict either the idea that the unconscious psyche is a counterpart of the conscious identity, nor the notion of the healthy balance of different functions in the psyche that helps the individual to evaluate and stimulate growth and development of consciousness. Remember, Jung psychology, we say that Jung says that the psyche is teleological, it's going somewhere, it's evolving. So that's why we think Jungian psychology is very positive in a sense, Darwinian, if you want, because it talks about evolution of the psyche, evolution of our consciousness. So this is very important when we say that there is a counterpart of our identity within the unconscious. We are talking about this balance that we all need. And also we are going to see when we talk about the concept of individuation in some classes, but it's going to be quite in some 2 or 3 classes, I think, that we are going to see that when we talk about individuation, it's all about us being whole, okay? Integrate our different aspects to make a whole, okay? To be ourselves, fully ourselves. So we are talking about balance. We are not talking, of course, about dissociation, about denying parts of ourselves, because this would lead to conflict, to neurosis, into, patterns, psychic patterns that are not healthy, okay? So let's go to another one. So anima is usually related to the emotional, empathetic, and sensitive aspects, while animus is related to the active, intellectual, exploring side of the personality. Here, it is important to understand that these definitions should by no means be perceived as literally describing certain characteristics, but that these images serve as symbols and are the abstractions of active animals and reflective anima principles correspondingly. So I think this is very, very important to understand, because nowadays we seem to be losing the capacity for symbolism, and everything is concrete, and everybody keeps discussing or fighting about things without realizing that when we are talking about psychic contents and functions and dynamics, we are mostly talking about symbols, the ways that the self, we have seen with the Professor Corbett in other meetings here. So the self with capital S, and as Joanna says, our spirit, okay, can talk, let's say, can relate to the ego. Okay, so that's very important, because as I was saying, we are here to evolve, to develop consciousness. So we need, the ego has to be mature enough to be able to listen, if we could say, to the messages of the self, because the self being our spirit and containing, as Joanna says, and containing all the knowledge of all the lives, all the development that we have had until this point, the self knows what we are here to do. We don't need anyone to tell us what we should do in our lives and where we should head, towards where we should head. Why? Because this development, we cannot do to one another, instead of one another. It's very private, if we could say, because it's our spirit that is evolving. So the soul, our spirit here reincarnated, has to figure out as a whole and develop this, if we could say, conversation, this dialogue between the ego and the self. Why? Because the ego has to adapt, to mature, and do the hard work of this experience here on earth. But the self has the knowledge of what is going on inside in the unconscious, that it's as Jung says, a whole system of planets, and not it's something that we don't know where it started and where it's going to end. Our unconscious, we can't visualize. So it's an uncharted land within ourselves. So it's very important that we understand that we have to develop this dialogue with our inner world and with ourself, okay? So this, one of the ways that the self talks to the ego, it's through symbolism. So this is very important, that I think this analyst was very, she has a Russian name, so I can't pronounce it, but you can go in the link and see the whole text, okay? So what I think it's very important, and it was a very nice way to put it, that these definitions of anima and animus, they are not literally describing characteristic, but they are describing a set of images and symbolism, through symbolism, of abstractions, okay, of what Jung wanted to say or discern with animals and anima, and what it's the principles that they are bringing to this conversation between the ego and the self, okay? So the active animus and the reflective anima. The anima as emotion and empathetic and sensitive aspects, and the animus as active, intellectual, exploring sides of personality. So let's go further. So anima and animus can be understood as, here, this part now, it's in the book Mirrors of the Soul. It's the series of Divaldo and Joanna. And this chapter is written by Gelson Luis Roberto. So anima and animals can be understood as relational structures that represent aspects of the individual soul. They are relational complexes because they have in their function this quality and role in the psyche. Remember that they help to in this dialogue between the ego and the self, okay? So the anima, feminine aspect in men, we could say, and the animals, the masculine aspect in women, represent the other within us. And also, according to Jung, a contrasexual element. Why? Just because of the ego's identity. In one of the part of the identity of the ego is the gender. So the opposite will be in the unconscious. The contrasexual element will be in the unconscious, okay? So according to Jung, as we partially integrate this opposite within ourselves, making it conscious, we increase our personal capacity to deal with the complexity of other people. This is very, very important, okay? We were talking the whole time of integration, remember, of knowing ourselves, of self-knowledge, because with self-knowledge, we integrate the different aspects of our souls, of our psyche, of our personality. So as we work to understand ourselves better, especially in this sense of the anima and animals, recognizing these characters, let's say, within our unconscious and the way they are functioning, okay? If they are immature or they are immature aspects, if they are more mature. So integrate as we are supposed to do with the shadow, for instance, another of our complexes. So then we increase our personal capacity to deal with the complexity of other people. Why? Because then we learn to deal in the first place with ourselves. As the same thing as we talked in last meetings about the shadow, because since ourselves are all connected in that transpersonal dimension where the archetypes, our ancient heritage is, okay, that it's common heritage for all of us. So this means that if we work better and integrate these aspects, for instance, of our psyche, we are going to be able to understand it and to deal better with the complexity of others, because we cannot do with others what we haven't done with ourselves, right? So as archetypes, they represent essential forces of the soul that organize and apprehend reality. Because remember, of all the functions and all the way, let's go back a little, that they are understood as relational structures, and that they represent, for instance, the anima, emotional, empathetic, sensitive aspects. So I need my anima if I'm a man, because being a woman or feeling a woman, or my consciousness taking the aspect of the feminine, my conscious ego, then I'm already dealing with emotional and the relational stuff that we need to deal, okay, in my consciousness. But what is going to be in my unconscious is the animals aspect, okay, the intellectual, the exploring side of personality, the active part. How we are going to be seeing this little by little. And today we're going to talk especially about the anima. But just for you to understand why here in this part, Gelson is saying that the archetypes represent essential forces of the soul that organize and apprehend reality, okay? Because all these ancient types of functions within ourselves, they are forms of expressions of the soul, of the psyche here. Remember when we talked with Professor Corbett last class, I think, or 2 classes previously, that the archetypes are also ways, they are very, we all have this common heritage, but we are going to express them in different ways. It depends on what they, which archetypes are more active in our individual lives. But anima and animals are within all of us in this contrasexual way, right? Because we all identify mostly with one way or the other, usually. Okay, this is all evolving nowadays, but usually we identify with a particular way of being masculine or more masculine or more feminine. It all depends. There are lots of degrees, okay, but the way that we identify and act mostly, and act also mostly, and also perceive and sense and deal with the world. Okay, let's go further and we can understand better. So they are the universal principles, we can think, of yin and yang in their feminine and masculine qualities. Now the symbolism, I think it's, when we talk about yin and yang, it's clearer for everyone, right? So while complexes, they are personifications related to the historical and reincarnatory context in which we live. That is, images and functions that reflect internalized masculine and feminine contents and experiences. Okay, we should take a pause here a little bit, because I don't know if everybody is very familiar with the concepts of yin and yang. And I think people who are listening to, or will be listening to this discussion, need to understand a little bit. So just some reminders, okay? So let's, I think here we have a little, okay. So yin and yang are concepts of Taoism that expose the duality of everything that exists in the universe. They describe the 2 opposing and complementary fundamental forces found in all things. Yin is the principle of night, the moon, passivity, absorption, the feminine. Yang is the principle of the sun, day, light, activity, and the masculine. We can say also the yin for earth, for instance, right? But what I think it's important that when we talk about Taoism, we are talking about the religion and philosophy from ancient China, connected to the philosopher Lao Tzu, who around 500 before Christ wrote the main book of Taoism, the Tao Te Ching. Taoists believe in spiritual immortality. So we are talking about something 500 BC, okay? The philosophy and religion. So just to remember, the Tao is the natural order of the universe. So Taoism teaches that all living creatures ought to live in a state of harmony with the universe and the energy found in it. So we have the Kai or Chi is the energy present in and guiding everything in the universe. Okay, this is just a reminder so that people can connect more with this this concept of yin yang, that it's very symbolic and it's so ancient, okay, so archetypal. So according to this idea, each being, object, or thought has a complement on which it depends for its existence. That complement exists within itself. Thus, it is deduced that nothing exists in the pure state, neither in absolute activity nor in absolute passivity, but in continuous transformation. Furthermore, any idea can be seen as its opposite when viewed from another point of view. In this sense, the categorization would only be for convenience. These two forces, yin and yang, would be the next phase of the Tao, the generating principle of all things, as we said, from where they arise and where they are destined. I think this ancient, beautiful ancient philosophy and knowledge that we seem to be losing because we seem to be always disagreeing. It's okay, we don't have to agree with everything, but we are not practicing this concept. Look at how beautiful that nothing exists in the pure state, at least in our universe, our known universe, because we are talking metaverse and this and that. We are evolving. I think this is great, but let's see here where in this moment where the soul is, right? So neither in absolute activity nor in absolute passivity, but in continuous transformation. So of course, and Jung talks a lot about that also in his collected works. So any idea can be seen as its opposite when viewed from another point of view. Isn't that interesting? That we seem to be losing this capacity of, and this, I love this, I found in the Google image, this image of yin and yang together with the moon and the sun, right? So everything is together within us. So it's so silly and, let's say, immature when we talk and we don't practice this and we are not flexible and we don't practice this way of listening to the other, and also because we have to practice listening to ourselves in the first place. We are talking about this today, right? So let's remember this. And we know that the spirit, now talking about the spirit, does not have sex in the narrow sense that we understand it, and that it, in its nature, it is both feminine and masculine, needing to experience these two realities in its evolutionary process. When in our egoic position, we assume a masculine polarity, and now we're talking about polarities, right? Because it's a spectrum, we could say, in the sense of the masculine and feminine forces. So when we assume in the ego a more masculine polarity, our feminine dimension will be more unconscious, forming a partial personality within the psyche. And likewise, when our ego is more feminine, our masculine dimension will present itself as an image in our unconscious. So I think this makes everything much clearer, right? We are talking about polarities and the conscious and the unconscious counterpart of them, right? So the anima and the animus are forces of connection of the self in a relationship of complementation and compensation. So they are complementary, and also they compensate each other. Remember the balance of the Tao, so that the psyche can fully relate with itself and with the world. For Jung, the anima and the animus as archetypes make possible the entrance to the collective unconscious. This is really important. And the experience with the self, I would say this is the highlight, okay, people, that for Jung, the anima and the animals as archetypes makes possible the entrance to the collective unconscious. Remember the transpersonal dimension of the psyche, where the numinous experience comes from, the sacred, okay, our connection to the sacred, and the experience with the self, capital S, because the self, as the spirit, as Joanna says, has all the knowledge in the first place of what we are doing here, okay, and also not in a diminished sense, but in a very important sense, to where we to where we are heading, if we could say. So they are psychopomps, that is, guides of the soul for the inner journey, not for the, you know, the death, as in different cultures. Psychopomps takes the soul of the dead, you know, to the other world. No, not to the other world beyond this world, but as psychopomps guiding the soul for the inner journey, for this uncharted land within ourselves, to what is most essential and fundamental in us. Also as complexes, okay, in the personal unconscious, they keep male and female images that will influence our choices of partners and our human relationships. So going back to the article in the Jungian Analytical Association, International Analytical Association, okay, the link is below, just remember everyone, reminding everybody. So being opposite to the embodied sexual identity, anima and animus are most easily related to the erotic encounters and partners and inspire the creative and artistic imagination, okay? When we are saying erotic encounters, we are not talking about only sexual encounters. We are talking about eros. That's the image there, and in the left side of the slide, for me at least, is eros and the psyche, right? So eros as a universal and impersonal force or power, not a feeling, okay? That of course has its roots on desire, but also it's a principle of union, connection, and attachment, okay? So it is in this sense that anima and animus are most easily related to the erotic encounters and partners, and inspire the creative and artistic imagination. Why, people? Because they, remember, they help the ego with this dialogue with the self, with our spirit, from where all creative and artistic forces within us and imagination come, okay? So in relationships, they are easily projected to the potential partners we are unconsciously attracted to. This is very important, okay? Because since the anima and animals are unconscious, we are going to project them. Usually we project them in the potential partners that we are unconsciously attracted to. Thus, the difficulty arrives at the moment when the projections lessen and fall, because when we get to know better our partners, of course, they are not going to correspond totally to our projections. So we start seeing the real person, and the projections lessen and fall. So the individuals are re-seen in the light of reality. Okay, then there is the difficulty. The hopeful aspect of this moment is that through this contact with his or hers own unconscious depths, the individual, through the mediation of anima and animus archetype, emerges out of the projective illusions, enriched and with a wider conscious spectrum of experiences. Because when I get back my projections, I have, of course, I'm looking, in a sense, I'm integrating what I've put outside of myself, right? So I have to realize, and I will realize, that some aspects of this encounter and that I projected onto my partner are actually mine, mine experiences and mine contents, okay? So of course, this process is much easier if the experience of such relationships was mostly positive and developmental than negative and defensive. Because when they are negative and defensive, we kind of go on, okay, we break up with the person, or we leave the family and the person, or we end a friendship. But I haven't, of course, then if I feel it's negative, oh, this person, that person did this and that to me, and I don't realize my part on it. Okay, so the projections go on. And what happens then, I don't integrate these aspects to my consciousness. And of course, I'm going to project again in the next partner. That's why many people keep changing partners, and never the person is enough or has this and that problem, because I haven't integrated my anima or animals. So I keep projecting onto the partner that it needs projection, actually, everything that it's unconscious and brings some kind of conflict. It's going to be projected. So this is very important to realize. So in dreams, the anima-animus archetype manifests in figures of strangers that are very attractive, mysterious also, and invite us to travel to the unknown. The presence of these archetypal images is perceived by their sudden and captivating effect, and a sense of being blessed or awakened, like what happened to Dante, for instance, when he saw his Beatrice. Yeah, everybody talks about Dante. So Jung used the concept of anima-animus as an image of the soul, the intimate personification of a person's psyche, not simply as the feminine side or the masculine side of people. This is very important. And anima-animus, so we can think of them, the soul, they are a representative of the soul, as mediator and conscious, okay, and conscious contents of the soul, as mediator between the ego and the self, between one person and another, the soul as a source of creative power, as the source of our identity and fulfillment. So some images that we can see in the Google images, and images of anima and animus. And here we have the Holy Grail. Okay, I think it's Guinevere maybe, and I don't know, Arthur, or don't know, people from the UK that are very, that know a lot about Arthurian myths. I can't remember
It's
the
Percival.
It's Percival, thank you.
He was the pure
Percival.
knight. And
yes, thank you.
Because
Percival.
He was
thank you. I forgot the name of the knight. And of course, we know that the Holy Grail is supposed to be the cup, right, that Jesus used in the Last Supper. And for those who don't know, it is an important symbol in the Arthurian myth, where it represents the unattainable perfection that Arthur's knights must strive towards. Okay, so now the anima, the woman within. This title I took from the book that I suggested to you, Man and His Symbols. Okay, and it's chapter 3, written by Marie-Louise von France. It's a beautiful chapter called The Process of Individuation. I strongly suggest that people read, okay, Man and His Symbols, and especially this chapter for our classes. So the anima is a personification of all the feminine psychological tendencies in a man's psyche, such as vague feelings and moods, prophetic hunches, receptiveness to the irrational, capacity for personal love, feeling for nature, and last but not least, his relation to the unconscious. Just going to put here. So it is, in its individual manifestation, the character of a man's anima is as a rule shaped by his mother. But I'll just go back to the, before seeing this, there is a very nice example here. When in the Man and His Symbol, in this chapter by von France, for instance, when we're talking about prophetic hunches, and von France says, a particularly good example of how the anima is experienced as an inner figure is in a man's psyche, is found in the medicine man and the prophets, shamans among the Eskimo and other Arctic tribes. Some of these even wear women's clothes or have breasts depicted on their garments in order to manifest the inner feminine side, the side that enables them to connect with the ghost land. Okay, because we are talking about shamans, so we are talking about medicine men in the past and present, because to this day we still have shamans in different countries, that they have all these intuitions, this prophetic hunch, and this way of curing by connecting with the spiritual world or ghost lands, as you want. So in its individual manifestation, the character of a man's anima is as a rule shaped by his mother. Then we are talking about in the personal experience and the personal unconscious. If he feels that his mother had a negative influence on him, his anima will often express itself as irritable, depressed moods, uncertainty, insecurity, and touchiness. If, on the other hand, a man's experience of his mother has been positive, this can also affect his anima in typical but different ways. Let's not forget what we saw in the beginning, that the central part of the complex is the archetype. And here we are talking also about Spiritist knowledge, about reincarnation. So if our spirit brings all the experiences of the feminine, of course, and the masculine, but here we are talking about the anima. So the man will have in his unconscious not only the experience of the mother, like shaping the complex of the mother complex, but also the anima, okay, his experience with the feminine. But also, if we talk about the center of the complex, the archetype, we are talking about something that it's this person brings in the depths of this man, in the depths of his psyche. Okay, so we are talking about a whole experience of past lives, for instance, with the feminine part. And this will also be present in the psyche, okay, but only in subtle, more subtle ways, okay? So let's see, the anima in its positive aspects is responsible for the fact that a man is able to find the right marriage partner, for instance. Another function is at least equally important. Whenever a man's logical mind is incapable of discerning facts that are hidden in his unconscious, the anima helps him to dig them out, okay? If the positive aspect of the anima. So even more vital is the role that the anima plays in putting a man's mind in tune with the right inner values and thereby opening the way into more profound inner depths. It is as if an inner radio becomes tuned to a certain wavelength that exclude irrelevancies, but allows the voice of the great man. When we say the great man, it's another way to talk about the self, capital S, to be heard. And don't we need this dialogue between the ego and the self? So in establishing this inner radio reception, the anima takes on the role of guide or mediator to the world within and to the self, okay? This is Joanna Franz talking about. And she talks about Jung's 4 stages of the development of the anima. So the first stage, so the more primitive, let's say, is best symbolized by the figure of Eve, which represents purely instinctual and biological relations. The second can be found in Faust's Ellen. She personifies a romantic and aesthetic level that is, however, still characterized by sexual elements, but with more romance, let's say. So the third is represented, for instance, by the Virgin Mary, a figure who raises love, eros, but in that sense that I told you, impersonal and universal force, to the heights of spiritual devotion, okay? So here we are talking a much more developed anima. And the fourth type is symbolized by Sapientia Sophia, okay? The wisdom transcending even the most holy and the most pure. And Joanna Franz says that in the psychic development of modern man, this stage is rarely reached. And we can see why, right? When we were talking about the shadow and the dark side of the self. So we need a lot of thinking about this, this evolution of the anima. So to integrate and develop the anima, it is necessary for man to take his feelings, moods, expectations, and fantasies seriously, fixing them in some way, for instance, in literature, art, etc. Then examine it both ethically and intellectually. This is a suggestion that Gelson does in this chapter of Mirrors of the Soul. The more distant man is from his inner world, the more difficult his relationship with feelings will be, and the more literal his relationship with the world will be. Remember that we were talking about, you know, this difficulty of symbolization and that we have nowadays. So imagine for man, if they are very literal, right? And with difficulty to connecting to their feelings, sorry. So we are talking then about a difficulty to relate to the inner world and to the self. So difficult with the anima, okay? Their literalness and the concrete relationship with the world represent a loss of contact with his anima, okay? Okay, now I just want, before the last slides, I wanted to tell you about a dream that I found in this paper in the site of the IAAP, that I think it's illustrates, because it's Von Franz gives a lot of dreams, but it's from the 50s, 60s. And this is a dream from our times, okay? So it's a man in his 40s, a competent professional with a solid position in a bank. Is practical, optimist, and a bit cynical. He denies the importance of emotional relationships and of his own acute sense of loneliness, believing that superficial social contacts are what he really wants, and that his dog is only his only true friend. He does not trust anyone and does not need anyone in his consciousness, okay? In a dream one night, he sees a gathering of his former schoolmates. This party is not boring like the parties he ordinarily attends, but full of joyful exchanges, like the parties of their youth long ago. Among the invitees, the guests, he sees a thin, pale woman dancing in a soft evening light. He is moved to tears and taken by surprise by his response to the sight of the woman in the dream. For several days, he is unable to forget the dream or the image of the slow dance that beckons him somewhere unknown. A week after the dream, he discovers that the receptionist at a seaside hotel where he usually goes with his dog at weekends resembles his dream figure. Somewhat shyly, he invites her for a coffee and suddenly bursts into confession about his most intimate feelings and long forgotten memories. They both notice that the world seemed different from that very moment and that a new hope arises. I think this was a beautiful dream. And the analyst says, we can discuss later if you want, but I put a small comment that she says that the dream evokes the emotional, romantic side of this man's soul. We can see also the evolution of the anima, right? And the figure of a dancing woman, an image of his anima, is so strongly charged with feelings that his habitual rigid defenses through cynicism, irony, and mistrust are deconstructed. The woman is so mysterious and at the same time so familiar that it's not possible to forget her. The man is looking at a portrait of his unconscious aspect. He remains charmed by this image long after the dream dissipates, and thus he is able to form a contact with his own vulnerable, sensitive, loving, and lively depth. The bridge between his ego and self emerges. It allows our hero to behave spontaneously in his routine daily life and opens a new way of internal and external communication for him, sincere, serene, and trustful. I think it's a very beautiful example of the development of the anima. And now to end this part and to open to questions, I'll give you one example that I love, that it's also personal and at the same time archetypal, okay? That it's from Chico Xavier's mother. There is a beautiful book that I think it's the second book that Chico Xavier psychographed. It's Letters from a Dad. I'm not sure it's translated to English. I don't know if people know that. But I just put some sentence. It's a beautiful book. If it's translated to English, I strongly suggest that you read it. So Chico Xavier was, I think it was in his 20-something, early 20s, when he psychographed his mother. And his mother just, for people that don't know, fell ill when he was, I think she died when he was around 5 or 6 years old, and left him and a lot of his sisters and brothers, a lot of them very, very small children, and the father gave them to distribute the children to friends of the family. And so because he was alone and he couldn't raise them, so until he marries again, but this is a story for another time. So this is Chico Xavier, biological and of course spiritual mother, Maria João de Deus, the spirit. So she says in this book, a spirit can benefit from what comes to it from the outside, but its true world is the one created by its thoughts, actions, and aspirations. Thought is everything. So this is in the beginning of last century, people. And Chico Xavier, remember, he had not elementary school finished. And it's wonderful, wonderful work, this psychography. So through these words, Maria João de Deus is saying, you will recognize how necessary it is to spread spiritualist truths in the world. They alone serve as the basis for all religious buildings. So it's a knowledge that a 20-year-old boy with not elementary school complete couldn't have, okay? And it's his mother because of all the information that she gives. And it's beautiful, and it's also archetypal. So you see, he stopped relating to his mother when he was 6. And imagine, for a person like a man like Chico Xavier, he was beginning his path and his mission here on earth, to have a mother. As you see, the mother is for the personal, for the complex of the anima, is very important. Okay, so to have the blessing of having the mother talking to him from the dead lands, from from the land of the dead, right? And giving such instructions that he had no idea at that point. I think it's a blessing, and also a very nice example, not only of the construction of this personal anima, that it's all going on, but also this depths of the anima as an archetype, this connection in this way, in this function of helping the ego to talk to the self, to talk to the spirit. Everything his mother was helping him to create, to develop his anima. So she says, my son, here are my unpretentious letters, the first impressions of my spirit in the life beyond the grave. Death is sovereign, and one day believers and non-believers will cross the paths of erratic life and will certify themselves of the spiritual things. Let your mediumship be like a melodious harp. However, the day you receive the favors of the world, as if you were selling its chords, it will rust forever. Goodbye, my son. Within all the hesitations and uncertainties of your life, remember that in this other world where you will return, you have a devoted sister who strives to have with her children who she left on earth the same heart, overflowing with sacrifice and love. Isn't that beautiful? So I will stop sharing now. And we can open to, to our dialogue, our questions, and just so that I can tell Mariana that is helping us if she can stop recording, or if she can record our questions and answers. Has everybody said okay to Fabrício?